Hey there, Teenacity fam. Today, I want to take you all on a trip down memory lane to those childhood days that many of us have spent glued to the captivating tales of the epic Ramayana. Every time I watched an episode, I was reminded of the exemplary conduct of Lord Ram, whether as a devoted son, or a caring brother, or a just ruler. His story deeply influenced how I value and nurture my own relationships. Today, as I stand on the threshold of adulthood, ready to navigate through life's adversity in a world filled with diversity, the importance of being authentic, leading a life of purpose with integrity while creating meaningful connections has never been clearer. As someone who's been both the elder and the little sibling, I've sat through my fair share of lead by example talks from my parents. Back when I was 10, trying to be like Lord Ram felt like a tall order. But now, as I'm growing up and taking on leadership roles at home and at school, it's starting to make a lot more sense. The more I reflect, the more I wonder, what is it about Lord Ram that makes him a timeless source of inspiration for today's youth? It's plain to see that his wisdom isn't just ancient history. It's a beacon guiding us through the complexities of modern life, even in the 21st century. So join me on my quest as I unravel the mysterious but undeniable connection between leadership and mental wellness, because I believe that just like Lord Ram, we all have the power to lead by example and make a difference in the world. In this episode, helping us discover what it truly means to be a leader in today's ever-changing landscape is our esteemed guest, Mr. Mohinish Sinha. He's the cream of the crop in the world of leadership. Sir has been in the game for over 25 years with tons of experience in organizational transformation, leadership development, and coaching. He's like the Yoda of leadership, except he's even cooler. Not only is he a partner at Deloitte India, but as the people and purpose leader, he helps organizations and their management to build the right culture and right leadership, which we'll definitely dive into later. But he's also lent his experience to startups and big short corporations alike. Talk about versatility. From education to oil and gas, banking to IT, you name it, he's conquered it. And when it comes to speaking gigs, let's just say that he's in high demand on the speaking circuit, gracing prestigious HR forums and academic institutions with his wisdom. Oh, and did I mention? He is a social media wizard. His webinars on leadership development are like the Avengers of online learning. They are packed with action and excitement. So with him on board, get ready for some downright awesome conversations that will not only unlock your leadership potential, but also give your mental wellness a serious boost. Welcome, sir. It's an honor to have you with us. Could you please share a little bit about your journey with our listeners?
Yeah, thank you, Adhiveer, and thanks for having me on your very precious podcast. So a bit about me. I was obviously born in Patna. And then, of course, I had an opportunity to live in different cities. So earlier years, I stayed in Delhi, and then I spent a large part of my growing up years in Kenya, in Nairobi. So I actually moved from a small child of 8-year-old or 9-year-old to an 18-year-old. So I spent in Nairobi in Kenya. So those were very important years to grow up in a very different environment. And then I came back to India and was educated here for my undergrad, for my master's, and did a lot of my work here. But that's one part of my journey. But the other part of my journey has been just fascinating. I've had the opportunity to know people from different cultures. So very early on in my life, I interacted with people from different nationalities and different groups, and really trying to fit in as a youngster. And you would appreciate that, Adhiveer, right? So it's how do you get accepted in an environment which is very different from yours?
Right.
So right from my language and the way I would speak those days, to the things that I would like to eat or things I'd love to do or hang out with would be very different for different groups of people. But those years were just fascinating because I made some great friends. Some of them I continue to be in touch with today. And I did a lot of great experiments, learning different things. So I really got great with sports. So I was really good with cricket, with chess. I played some very serious chess. I had the privilege of beating an international master twice in my early years in school, and played very decent table tennis, was fascinated by physics in those years. So those kind of, all this became my place of experiment, and I learned a lot. And, one of the consequences of that was that by the time I was nearing my school end, or, my A level, as it was called, class 12, I wasn't sure what I really wanted to do. I was clearer about what I didn't want to do, which is, I guess, is the state for most of most people at that age. But everything was exciting. Everything was a possibility. But I followed my heart and, did my undergrad and my graduation in physics. And then I got introduced to psychology. I became a counselor, crisis intervention counselor. I got into media. I used to make films for children. I just worked with my heart and just chased up things that made a lot of sense. And eventually, my dad was quite firm, saying, "Okay, this is all very good. I think you should do something more serious." So I got into an MBA, and where the life kind of changed, became a little more formal. But I can say this much, Adhiveer, that all those formative years of meeting different people, trying out different things, learning different things. Today, all of those things have somewhat come in the way of shaping who I am and the choices of work I do, which makes me very unique as a person, even though it sits under the designation of what I do. I'm a purpose and people leader. I do work in leadership development. But I think those years and those experiences have just shaped me very, very differently.
How very, very interesting, sir. I think your journey really shows how intercultural links sort of weave into, as you said, your character, and you mentioned your interest in cricket and chess. And I can't help but tell you that even I'm interested in those two sports very,
Oh,
very much.
lovely.
I think being in India, cricket first and foremost is the sport that you just grow up with everything around you. It's almost a religion in India. And
Right.
chess as well, from a very young age, I was introduced to chess by my parents because I used to be a very restless kid and I used to be running around the house and be very fidgety. And I think it was introduced to me to show me the value of traits like focus and patience and calculated thinking, strategic thinking. But over time, I grew such a great love towards chess, particularly because I am very interested in all kinds of competition. And there are countless tournaments I've played over the last 7 to 8 years. Unfortunately, I haven't beaten an international master yet, but maybe in the years to come. So I think I'll cut right to the chase. You talked about how your position in leadership, it's been a result of all the interactions that you've had as a child, all the different cultures that have been introduced to you. And you mentioned a huge cultural shift at the very young age of 8. And I think all of that perhaps shapes how you approach leadership. So, sir, I would like to ask you, how would you define leadership? And why is developing leadership skills so important for my mental health as a teenager or anyone for that regard?
That's a great question, Adhiveer. Leadership to me, is responsibility. And what really happens to each one of us is that as we are growing up, things happen to us. We experience different things. But when we start taking responsibility for ourselves and for the environment we are operating in, that shows up as leadership. And I'll give you an example, and I'm sure you know of it, and I'm sure you are doing it as well, right? It's about very simply, right? You see a piece of crumpled paper lying on the floor in the house, in school, or wherever else you go, perhaps in your dad's office, right? It's just lying there, and there's nothing you have to do. It's not your responsibility to pick it. But if you did go and pick it up and put it in the bin, that to me is a leadership act. And that sort of brings it to the second point I want to say is leadership is an act and not a position. It's an act. It's the way that we signal to the world that I care and I take responsibility for what's going on. And it's been a hard thing to develop even in myself in my early years. I was a shy kid, introverted, very introverted. I continue to be. I used to feel that maybe I'm not fitting in the environment that I'm going into. But I realized that who I am as an introvert, as a person who likes to hang out reading books and play chess on the side on my own. I would play against myself. I would love that environment and rather interacting with people. But I realized that when I took a step forward and took care of my friends, right, my classmates who may be struggling with something, maybe a homework. I remember distinctly that a few of them would not study throughout, and then of course the day before the exam, right? And and it struck me that look, not that I was the smartest of the kid, but I may have some understanding of whatever you said. So I would spend time and help them get better, and those kind of helped me grow as a person. Now the question for you, the point that I want to raise to you, Adhiveer, is I was not like that initially, right? I actually saw a few people do this. Some of my classmates in school. There was a lovely friend of mine who continues to be a friend till today. We were in, I think, Form 1 or the early years, I think class 8th or 9th, I think that's what it was. And this kid, his name is Andrew Okalo. Andrew is a great creative director in Kenya. He runs an own agency now. But there's something about him that I used to find that he was again a quiet kid, but moment he would see something going wrong in the classroom, he would go ahead and courageously took charge. And I used to look at him, and one day I caught up with him and said, "Hey, Andrew, what makes you do this, right? And as in school, I don't know how is your school, but in the school I was in, there were kids who were bullies, and there were kids who were really, hanging out with, doing the right thing. And he was absolutely courageous. He didn't care whether the group of people who would take on were the bullies or the other way, right? And I asked him, so what makes you do that? And he said, look, Manish, if I don't do the right thing, I won't be at peace. I wouldn't be at peace if I let something wrong happen in front of me. And that really inspired me. And then I tried to emulate some of that, and I got better at it. So to me, in simple terms, is just that. Another question then becomes is what is responsibility? But what do you take responsibility for? And that's a very important one, right? It's taking responsibility of my environment, my situation, my house, my school, my nation, right? My planet is just goes in the way of what's the area of concern I lay out in front of myself. And you and your friends are all the future of the world, and certainly of India. I love to speak to youngsters to remind them of the superpower they have to take responsibility beyond just the small arena that you are in. And you're already demonstrating it through this podcast and reaching out to youngsters and talk to them and inspire them to take responsibility in a bigger scale. So long answer, but hopefully this was useful.
Yes, sir, it definitely was. How very profoundly put by you that leadership is a responsibility, and there are different scales to which you can display your responsibility. And the first step for that is, of course, taking accountability for everything around you. Like you mentioned, your friend Andrew, and we put it very, very eloquently, sir. So I think this is going to be a wonderful learning. But just to connect this leadership to the mental well-being side of it bit, you mentioned how you were an introvert in school, but despite that, you decided to emulate some of the things that you saw around you. So what specific leadership traits do you think contribute to a better mental well-being for the person who's trying to take responsibility and take accountability around them? And what are the things they do that really contribute to their own mental well-being? Because you mentioned, I think, for your friend Andrew, that he would not feel peace. He would not feel at peace with himself had he not taken action or stopped certain things happening around him. Even the example you mentioned about just having a crumpled piece of paper at the side, I think some people would see that, and not picking that up for them would be something that would be troubling them, because then it puts them into sort of moral dilemma. So I think the question, if I just want to put it down to a couple of words, is what specific leadership qualities contribute to a better mental well-being?
So have you heard of a term called growth mindset?
Yes, sir. Yes,
you would have, right?
In fact, we do have a podcast on that.
Oh, you do? Fabulous. So Leadership Act kind of sits on top of this growth mindset, as different from a fixed mindset. So growth mindset is the mindset where you see effort and learning as a way of growing. So you don't see yourself as, oh, this is my capability and this is not my capability. So really, the folks who demonstrate Leadership Act tend to operate from growth mindset. And one important quality of growth mindset, therefore, that's required is that you see yourself as a work in process, right? You don't see yourself as a final product that, look, now I am a rock star and therefore this is who I am. I am continually improving. I'm continually getting better. And that is the foundation of mental health, right? It is a foundation of becoming that person who sees himself or herself as someone who's trying to get better. What that means is there is some distance I need to go to get there. And the second is that the better is an unending ceiling, right? You continue getting better. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? The practical term means that by way of quality, right, that I continually seek feedback as to how am I doing right now. I continue seek feedback in terms of things that I can do better. Right. So that's one sort of quality of it. But this is not sufficient, right? This part is not sufficient, but it is an essential piece. But there's another piece that is important, right? Which is about knowing what is in my control and what is not. The locus of control, right? That the locus of control is a very interesting point. It's different from responsibility that I talked about, right? This is the piece. So locus of control is, look, I may be caring about the climate, but I, as a 17-year-old person, the best I can do is educate my peers, perhaps, around climate and sensitivities and doing around that, Adhiveer.
Very true, sir. I think a lot of what our culture brings has been lost, especially in this digital age. I think I can recognize the teenagers and my peers. We are just inherently, I don't know why, but there's a lack of interest in our own culture, in our own, what we call our Sanskriti. And I think personally, I find that quite saddening because there are so many beautiful stories that have been brought out by these scriptures. You hear about the stories of Shikhandi and Mahabharata, and yesterday was International Women's Day, and there are stories of these great female warriors in India, and I think there are so many of these stories that can beautifully show inclusion and diversity in our own culture. And I think if we can recognize that in our own culture, and we can recognize that this has been a part of our values from millennia, then I'm sure that even in today's world, we can inculcate some of these values in our own environments and in our own communities, and we can bring forth values of respect and inclusion for others. So, sir, you're an expert in the field of diversity, in the field of equity, and in the field of inclusion yourself. I think it was a role that you had for quite a significant amount of time. So, sir, could you share with our audience some examples of how this practice is being increasingly adopted, whether it be in schools, in colleges, or in sports, to create a community where diverse voices are heard and valued?
That's a great question. So I think the big work that is happening in all schools, colleges, even in social and sports arena and workplaces as well, is a recognition that, to our earlier question, that there are some unconscious biases that drive a lot of the connects we have. So we tend to connect bases. Oh, are you from this school, or are you from this social class, or are you an Indian, or are you from a certain nationality or language? So gender, right? LGBT plus, that whole dimension of people who want to be acknowledged as a different gender, or how they want to be seen as. There are unconscious biases that each one of us have around how people want to express themselves, right? So even in the earlier question, here is the old lady, who's poor, who's going to eat the fruit and give it to me. It's going to be, not healthy and so on, right? I mean, those are biases that we have. So I think big work that has been going on is acknowledging those biases. And as a consequence of it, seeing how can we first put the bias on the table and then have an open conversation to illustrate the women gender and inclusion of women gender has been one of the most dominant shifts that has been happening in the last decade. I mean, it's been happening for some time now, but in the last decade, it has really picked up in India and certainly across the globe. And the key element around bias in, say, school and colleges were girls don't like STEM courses. They like language courses. And a lot of the girls would be encouraged to not go towards STEM, and the boys would be encouraged not to go towards languages and so on, right? And these biases would sit even in the family, in where you're part of. And I think a lot more appreciation in the educators. So the teachers, the administrative parts of the school, which is the principal and the the administrators, are aware of that those biases show up as the kind of judgment we make on the youngsters. They have been training to make sure that they acknowledge it, right? So that's what we can the best do to these is acknowledge our own biases. The second place where these biases are also showing up is not just the pre-bias, but the bias is in the classroom, right? In the way students would talk to each other, or teachers would talk to them. The choices after school, that the individuals will make on career, on what they would want to go for, etc. So I think there's a lot been happening in that today. Parents are a lot more sensitive about it. Children are, of course, very sensitive. Teachers and educators are more sensitive. And therefore, you're seeing very different sets of people going into unthinkable careers. There are women who are sort of picking up careers in becoming a taxi driver, for example, or a truck driver. There have been cases of that. The second thing that is happening, along with acknowledging the biases, the shifts in the policies that these institutions are making, right? Earlier, we know, good old days, women would not be allowed to vote, for example, or do a certain kind of a program or get into careers like that, right? One of my batchmates, she went into the liquor industry as a salesperson, right? Unthinkable at that time, 30 years ago. She challenges status quo, and the policies in that company allowed for that. It's okay, right? We We believe in it, even though it is not a social norm to have a woman going on selling liquor, and she was in that business. So therefore, the policies have started shifting. Policies have started changing, allowing for these shifts to happen. And third is, which is that there is a constant dialogue. There is a lot more discussion like we are having right now, as well as in environments which are academic, which are administrative, which are government, right? They're talking at the highest level, surfacing the challenges of the system and what you may have heard of as systemic biases, right? That the way certain groups of people are developed, they don't have a chance at all to ever make it into that. So there's a lot more dialogue that is happening around systemic biases in India, in different parts of the world. And those systemic biases, as they are getting talked about, they're getting reconstructed, they're challenged. And newer models are emerging as we speak. So I'm very optimistic about where we are, but we have a long distance to go around it. And the one final point on this, I would say, is interestingly, AI can be a potential aid for us if we use it well, because AI can also be biased, because the person coding that AI may have his or her unconscious bias coded in. But used well, AI could be used to eliminate, identify the biases, identify the systemic biases, and help us to solve it. So we are going into a good place, provided we take the right leadership calls, the right values, and we solve the right problems.
Very well said, sir. I completely agree with you. I think in these sort of institutional roles, there is a huge paradigm shift that has been happening. And as you very rightly mentioned, it's been expedited over the last couple of years. In fact, you mentioned the role of teachers and administrative faculty in this role. And I think in a developing country like India, it's only in these positions that this change can sort of become a part of our upbringing, so that now for future generations, it is a given rather than something that has to be learned. And I think something very interesting that I'm being taught in my course as a subject, of course, we study languages, and something that I hadn't come across in my previous school, but I am now in this new school that I'm in, is that there's a course of poetry that's been taught to us. And there's this poet, Caroline Duffy, and she is a body of work that encompasses of a lot of poems that are sort of reconstructive narratives into ancient Western stories and mythologies. So, we might have heard about the story of Lazarus or Midas or Achilles for that point of view. And what she does is that she sort of recreates these poems with the perspective of the female, who's traditionally shown in a supporting role in those specific stories, but they are now the protagonist, and they're now sort of creating their own story there. And it's very interesting because we were just recently learning about how they sort of break the gender norms and stereotypes. And I think it's a very, very interesting move. And I think, as you said, we're very optimistic for the future. I think it's just a matter of being open-minded. It's just a matter of being empathetic. And it's a matter of redeveloping our belief system to accommodate at the ideology that there are others who are equals and that they should be treated as equals as well. And I think it's a very pertinent thought, sir. And I think this is a great note to end the question and answer segment on. And now I'll take you to a lighter, less serious, more interesting segment of this podcast, which is the rapid fire round. So for the sake of this segment, I'll just be giving you around 3 to 5 seconds to gather your thought and answer these questions, just for an authentic view on your answers. So some interesting questions coming your way. First one being, if you could have a superpower to enhance your leadership skills, what would it be?
Okay. So I'm a big fan of Avengers, and I love Hawkeye. His agility, his rapidity with which he sort of paces himself. So I love that superpower if I could have it.
Perfect, sir. What's the weirdest or most unexpected place that you've ever found inspiration for your leadership?
So once it happened that I had taken a bunch of teenagers on a hike, and the idea was to give them a certain challenge. And then it started raining heavily, so we really couldn't go out. We were sort of stuck. So we went to a small hut which was owned by some villager, and so the 8 or 10 of us, we were huddled in that. Day was getting wasted. It was raining incessantly. So there and then I invented, okay, guys, our leadership act would be clean up this hut and make it livable. The old man was very, very happy. Kids learned something. And I felt saved. Okay. Unexpected situation. I managed to get something done.
That's quite heartwarming, sir. Very heartwarming instance. This one's a bit tricky. If you had to describe your leadership style using a movie title, what would it be?
I think I would go with Invictus. This idea that whatever is thrown at you, you build something stronger out of it by sheer effort.
Wow. I think I'll have to watch that movie now.
You should. It's a fabulous movie. Yeah.
Right. If you could have dinner with any historical figure that you'd find very interesting to discuss leadership over, what would
Oh,
it be?
oh, there are two guys. There are plenty actually, but two I've always been fascinated by. One was Richard Feynman, a
Richard
physicist
Chinman.
in Caltech, who died not too long ago, but that time I was not too aware of him. And the second is Buddha. I would love to sit down with both of them and hear their version of why, how do they see the world today, and what would the advice they would have for me.
I'm sure that would be a very, very interesting dinner conversation to have. So what's the weirdest piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh yeah, very early on, I was always I got irritated, when I was growing up, when my mother would say, "Sab theek ho jayega, everything will be okay," right? And I
Mhm.
said, "How do you know, right? Everything is going to be okay." So it always looked like a weird advice, but it's weirdly true. You leave everything, everything sort of settles in the right way. Weirdly simplistic as it is, I think it's a fascinatingly a wise advice, which I live to even today.
Wow. Wow. I think I've been on the receiving end of that remark also several times, but I think slowly with your experiences as they build up, you start understanding that I think the most pertinent piece of advice that I'd be giving to the teenagers listening to this podcast is that mother is always right.
Oh, mother is always right.
Mother
Absolutely.
is always right. You mentioned how for many years in your life, you used to have this act where you used to give yourself some months to learn some skill or to test yourself or to push your limits,
Yeah.
right? So, what's the most bizarre talent or skill you've ever attempted to learn?
Oh, I can't say it's a bizarre skill, but I picked up in a bizarre sort of a context. Is this was again, I would go to Doordarshan to get a piece of work, and in those days, you basically the producer would say, "Do you know this?" You would say yes, right? And so he asked me, "Look, we need a musician here, a music director here. So
Right.
can you play music?" And I had no clue. And I said yes, as all of 18 or 19 at that time, I think. So great. Now the time has come. The director is asking me, okay, get the musician going. So I had someone who played the keyboard and so on. And the scene was that we had to do this animals, who were sort of going on the screen, and this has to be music. There's sounds of animals that we had to record. So there was a lot of hard work. Finally, the way it happened was that my keyboard player wasn't as good, so he and I we did some work on this, and then I made all the animal sounds that you can think of.
Oh,
Using the
wow.
keyboard made it more real
Oh,
in that sense. Without going to any animal, and those days we never had this benefit of internet to tell us what those
right.
sounds are. So we made an outstanding clip, and the director was happy. He said, "Wow, this is fantastic! You guys solved it." But it just came out from my
That's
not knowing music, and me using animal sounds, voices, using my voice. So
that's
that's
very,
a
very
skill I kind of
fascinating.
developed there and then. It seemed to work.
All right. So, speaking of your 18 or 19-year-old self, the last question to sum this up would be one piece of advice that you would give yourself when you were around at that time.
Beautiful. So I've always thought about it, right? If there was one thing I could give advice, is I would tell my younger self, stay at one thing little longer. I tended to sort of jump from one skill to the other. Oh, I've learned taekwondo. Okay, now let's move into this. No, no, let's move into that. So I did a lot of great things, but I didn't build depth. So if I go back, I'll remind myself to build depth in something. And I think now I can see that when I build depth, I learn that much more. So that's something I would certainly tell my younger self.
I think very, very well said, sir. I think in our sort of Indian culture, it's embedded that, ye bhi karna hai, ye bhi karna hai. So there's a lot of jumping around to do. But I think if you stick to something for a lengthy period of time, if you have sustained effort in that field, then
Yeah.
you truly get a chance not only to find your skill, but to also develop and hone that skill. So I think that's very well mentioned by you, sir.
Thank you.
And as we wrap up, I'd like to introduce the final segment we like to call the words of wisdom. And in this segment, we asked our esteemed guests to share a profound piece of advice or a teaching that they've encountered in their journey. So, sir, for all the teens listening to this podcast, could you share a piece of wisdom or a principle that's been a guiding light for you? Something that our teen listeners can take away from your incredible journey, summed up in a sentence or two.
Very simply, know yourself and be the best version of yourself, not anyone else, just yourself. Each one of us are rock stars in the way we are. We just got to discover who we are and be that best version.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so
you,
very
Adhiveer.
much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your invaluable insights on nurturing team leadership, on promoting inclusivity and diversity. And I think a lot of the things you mentioned are very pertinent and enriching takeaways for myself and everyone listening to this podcast. I think personally, this conversation has been very enlightening, and I'm going to listen to the recording once or twice again to get a deeper understanding of what you said. So I think whatever you've said has made incredible sense to me, and I think it's very inspiring. So thank you very much for sparing your time and joining me, sir.
Thank you, Adhiveer. And I must say, keep on doing this great work. I'm sure it's making a difference to a lot of the youngsters. And, that's my example of taking responsibility, right? You're going beyond just my limited area. So well done, Adhiveer. And I'm sure you're an inspiration to many. I certainly feel very inspired to see a youngster doing this great work. So all the very best to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that sir's engaging presence and thoughtful contributions have truly enriched this discussion, and I look forward to implementing his wisdom in my quest to empower future leaders and create more inclusive communities. So, Teenacity fam, if you're ready to unleash your inner leader and make some positive changes in your life, and maybe even change the world while you're at it, then hit that subscribe button, because you wouldn't want to miss a single episode of the Teenacity Talks podcast. This is Adhiveer Kapuria signing off for now. Peace out.